"You must be Dr. Walsh," called a voice from behind rows of metal shelving. Martin Chen, the archive's curator, emerged carrying a weathered cardboard box. "The Blackwood collection just finished de-acidification treatment yesterday. Perfect timing." Eleanor smiled, setting her bag on a nearby table. "I've been waiting months to get my hands on these. The family held onto them for over 150 years. "Quite the coup for the university," Martin said, carefully placing the box on the examination table. The Blackwoods were prominent Massachusetts industrialists during the war. These should provide valuable insight into upper-class domestic life in wartime Boston. Eleanor pulled on cotton gloves and opened the box. Inside, protected by acid-free tissue paper, lay dozens of daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and early paper photographs, each in its own protective sleeve. She lifted the first one, a formal family portrait from 1863, according to the handwritten label on its reverse. The photograph showed a stern-faced man in his 40s, presumably Theodore Blackwood, seated beside his wife. Behind them stood 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, ranging from approximately 5 to 15 years of age. Unlike most period photography, where subjects maintained rigid poses due to long exposure times, these children's faces held unnerving smiles. "That's unusual," Eleanor murmured, examining the image under the magnifying lamp. Victorian photography rarely captured smiles. Martin leaned over her shoulder. "The Blackwood children. According to the documentation, that's William, Mary, Thomas, and little Elizabeth." Eleanor felt an inexplicable unease as she studied their faces. While the parents maintained the expected solemn expressions, each child bore an identical tight-lipped smile that didn't reach their eyes. Their gazes seemed fixed slightly above the camera, as if watching something beyond the photographer. "I'd like to digitize this one first," Eleanor said, setting it aside. The contrast between the parents' traditional poses and the children's expressions might make for an interesting journal article. Later that afternoon, Eleanor uploaded the high-resolution scan to her computer and began the meticulous process of digital restoration. As she zoomed in to address a spot of damage on young Thomas's collar, she froze. The boy's smile, magnified on her screen, wasn't a smile at all. His lips were pulled back in what appeared to be a grimace, teeth clenched in what looked disturbingly like fear. Puzzled, she zoomed in on each child's face. Under magnification, their expressions transformed from placid smiles to rigid masks of terror. Mary's eyes were wide, pupils dilated. William's jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle bulged in his cheek. Little Elizabeth's lips trembled visibly, captured mid-quiver by the camera. "What the hell?" Eleanor whispered, pushing back from her desk. Her office phone rang, startling her. It was Martin. "Dr. Walsh, there's something odd about that Blackwood photograph. I found a notation in the donor papers you should see." Eleanor glanced back at her screen, where 4 terrified children stared back at her. "I'm on my way," she said, unable to tear her eyes away from their faces. As she reached to shut down her computer, she could have sworn William's eyes shifted slightly, looking directly at her. Martin was waiting at the archives entrance, a manila folder in his hands. His usual composed demeanor had given way to visible agitation. "I was cataloguing the donor documents," he explained, leading Eleanor to a small office adjoining the archive room. "I found this tucked between the deed of gift and the inventory list." He opened the folder and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, a handwritten letter dated November 12th, 1863, just weeks after the photograph was taken. Eleanor slipped on a pair of gloves and carefully unfolded it. "My dearest sister, I write with grave concern regarding Theodore's decision to commission the family portrait. The children have not been the same since that dreadful day. They wake screaming in the night, speaking of a figure they claim stood behind the photographer, a tall man in black whom only they could see. Mary insists this phantom pointed at them and commanded their silence with threats too terrible to repeat to their mother or myself. William, who at 15 should be beyond such fancies, refuses to enter the parlour where the portrait now hangs. Yesterday, I discovered Thomas attempting to burn the photographer's business card, claiming the man wasn't really a man at all. Little Elizabeth no longer speaks. I have suggested to Theodore that the portrait be removed, but he dismisses the children's distress as mere hysteria. I fear something unnatural occurred that day, something that has followed them home. Please come at once. Your worried brother, Jonathan Blackwood. Eleanor looked up from the letter, a chill running through her. Is there more correspondence? Martin shook his head. Nothing I've found so far, but there's this. He handed her another document. This one from a Boston newspaper, dated December 1863. It was a brief obituary notice for Jonathan Blackwood, age 38, who had reportedly fallen down the main staircase of the Blackwood residence in what was described as a tragic household accident. What about the children? Eleanor asked, scanning the clipping for additional information. That's where things get stranger, Martin replied, opening a leather-bound ledger. According to family records included with the donation, all 4 Blackwood children died within 6 months of this photograph being taken. Influenza was listed as the cause for the younger 3, while William allegedly drowned in the Charles River. Eleanor's mind raced back to the image on her computer screen. 4 young faces contorted in terror, seemingly invisible to anyone viewing the photograph without magnification. I need to see the original again, she said. They returned to the examination table where the Blackwood collection lay. Eleanor carefully retrieved the portrait and placed it under the magnifying lamp. The children's expressions appeared just as they had initially, unnaturally cheerful, but not overtly frightened. I don't understand, she muttered. On my computer, when enlarged, their expressions changed completely. Martin looked skeptical. Technology artifacts, perhaps. Digital enhancement can sometimes create false details. No, Eleanor insisted. It was too consistent, too deliberate. She took out her phone and snapped a picture of the portrait, then zoomed in. Once again, the children's faces transformed into masks of terror. Look, she urged, showing Martin the screen. His skepticism vanished. My God, he whispered. What happened to these children? As they stared at the screen, a power surge from the storm outside caused the lights to flicker. In that momentary darkness, Eleanor could have sworn she felt cold breath on the back of her neck. When the light stabilized, she turned to find herself alone in the room. "Martin?" she called. No answer came, but the archive door stood slightly ajar. Eleanor moved toward it, phone still in hand. As she glanced down at the screen, her blood froze. In the digital image, William Blackwood's head had turned, his terrified eyes now looking directly out of the frame, directly at her. A crash from the adjacent storage room propelled her into motion. Eleanor rushed toward the sound, finding Martin standing amid scattered boxes, his face ashen. "Are you all right?" she asked, rushing to help him. "I thought I saw someone," he stammered, eyes darting to the shadows in the corner. A man in dark clothing, just for a second when the lights flickered. Eleanor felt her skin prickle. The figure from the letter? The one the children saw? Martin shook his head, as if trying to clear it. That's absurd. It was just a shadow, the storm playing tricks. But his voice lacked conviction. Together they gathered the fallen materials, mostly modern documentation unrelated to the Blackwood collection. As Eleanor helped replace a box on the shelf, she noticed a small leather journal wedged between larger volumes. The name Mary Blackwood was embossed in faded gold lettering on its cover. "This wasn't in the inventory," she said, carefully extracting it. Martin frowned. "It must have been misplaced during the initial processing." They returned to the examination table, where Eleanor gently opened the journal to reveal the childish handwriting of a 12-year-old girl from 1863. Many pages had been torn out, but entries remained from the weeks following the portrait session. October 18th, 1863. "Father forbids us to speak of what happened during the portrait. Mother thinks we're being difficult children. Only Uncle Jonathan believes us. The photographer brought something with him, something that hid in his camera. I saw its shadow when the flash powder ignited, stretching across the wall, much larger than the photographer himself. William says we mustn't look at the portrait once it's delivered. He says the creature needs our eyes to find its way out. Eleanor turned the brittle page with trembling fingers. October 25th, 1863. The portrait arrived today. Father hung it in the parlour despite our pleas. Thomas cried until he made himself sick. Elizabeth hasn't spoken a word since the sitting. I hear her screaming in her sleep. The photographer was found dead yesterday. The newspaper says he hanged himself in his studio. His assistant told the police he'd been acting strangely after our session, complaining about shadows that moved independently of their owners. I fear we've let something terrible into our home. The next several pages had been ripped out. The final intact entry was dated November 30th, a few weeks after Jonathan Blackwood's death. It's taken Uncle Jonathan. Father still won't listen. William tried to destroy the portrait last night, but Father caught him. He's been locked in his room without supper. I heard him whispering through the wall that it visits him at night, standing at the foot of his bed. Elizabeth still won't speak, but she draws the same picture over and over, a tall man with impossibly long arms standing behind our family. She burns each drawing after she finishes. I've started seeing it too from the corner of my eye. Always watching, always smiling. It wants us to smile back. The journal ended there. Eleanor looked up at Martin, who had grown increasingly pale as she read aloud. "We need to secure the photograph," she said. "Something's not right." They turned toward the examination table, but the portrait was no longer where they'd left it. The protective sleeve lay empty on the surface. "Did you move it?" Martin asked, voice strained. Before Eleanor could answer, her phone chimed with a notification. Opening it, she found that the photo she'd taken of the portrait had changed again. Now all 4 children were looking directly at the camera, their faces twisted in silent screams. Behind them, barely visible in the shadowy background of the image, stood a tall, thin figure in black, its face an indistinct blur, except for a wide, impossible smile. As Eleanor stared in horror, a text message appeared on her screen from an unknown number. "We tried to warn you." The lights went out, plunging the archive into darkness. "We need to find that photograph," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Martin nodded, his face ghostly in the emergency lighting. They began a methodical search of the archive room, checking under tables and between shelves. The photograph seemed to have vanished entirely. "This is impossible," Martin muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Items don't just disappear from a secure archive." Eleanor's mind raced back to Mary Blackwood's journal. She wrote that William tried to destroy the portrait. Maybe that's what we need to do. Destroy university property? A historical artifact? Martin looked scandalized despite his fear. "That's grounds for immediate termination, not to mention possible criminal charges." "4 children died, Martin," Eleanor hissed, "and Jonathan Blackwood and the photographer all connected to this portrait." A soft sound interrupted their argument, the whisper of paper sliding across the floor. They both turned to see the Blackwood portrait lying in the center of the room, several feet from where they'd been searching. "That wasn't there a moment ago," Martin whispered. Eleanor approached cautiously and knelt beside the photograph. In the red emergency light, the image appeared altered. Theodore and Mrs. Blackwood remained unchanged, but the space where the children had stood was now empty, as if they had been erased from the portrait. "Martin, look at this," she called, her voice cracking. As he approached, the light suddenly returned to full power. Eleanor blinked against the brightness, and when her vision cleared, she gasped. The photograph had returned to its original state, all 4 children present, wearing those unnatural smiles. "I saw it too," Martin confirmed before she could question her sanity. "They were gone, and now they're back." Eleanor's office phone rang in the distance. After exchanging glances with Martin, she hurried to answer it, desperate for any connection to the outside world. "Historical Photography Department," she answered. There was no response but the sound of static, punctuated by what might have been children's voices, too faint to make out. Then a man's voice, distant as if speaking from the bottom of a well. They were meant to replace them. The children, mine for theirs. The line went dead. Eleanor's hand shook as she replaced the receiver. When she returned to the archive room, she found Martin staring at his computer screen, his expression horrified. "I looked up Theodore Blackwood's business records," he explained as she approached. His textile factories employed children as young as 6. There was a fire at one of his mills in early 1863. 17 children died when they couldn't escape the locked workroom. The investigation was suspiciously brief, he continued, scrolling through the digitized newspaper articles. Blackwood was cleared of all responsibility, despite witness statements about the locked doors. He made a large donation to the city afterward, and the matter was closed. Eleanor felt sick, and months later his children began seeing a strange figure after having their portrait taken. "There's more," Martin said grimly. "I found birth records for the Blackwood family. They only had one child, William. Mary, Thomas, and Elizabeth weren't their biological children." "What?" "But the family records are falsified," Martin interrupted. "I cross-referenced with city census data. 3 children from families of Blackwood's mill workers came to live with them in early 1863 after the fire. Orphans whose parents had died in the blaze." Eleanor stared at the portrait on the examination table. "He took them in after killing their parents," she whispered. "Was it guilt, or just to improve his public image after the scandal?" "Either way," Martin said. "Something found them through this photograph, something connected to those dead children from the mill." As if responding to his words, the lights flickered again. When they stabilized, the portrait had changed once more. Now the children's expressions were calm, almost peaceful. Behind them stood the indistinct figure, its arm extended toward the photographer. Eleanor's phone chimed in her pocket. When she checked it, she found her photograph of the portrait had updated. The children were gone from the image. Instead, different children stood in their places, gaunt-faced, wearing simple clothes, their expressions solemn. 17 mill children, standing where the Blackwood children had been. At that moment, the archive door swung open. Campus Security Officer Diane Williams stood in the doorway, flashlight in hand. "Everything okay down here? The power's been fluctuating all over campus because of the storm." Eleanor and Martin exchanged glances. "We're fine," Eleanor managed. "Just some research that took an unexpected turn. After Officer Williams left, promising the physical plant was working on stabilizing the power, Eleanor carefully returned the photograph to its protective sleeve. "What do we do now?" Martin asked. Eleanor stared at the sleeve containing the portrait. "We document everything, but we keep the original sealed. No more digital enhancement, no more enlargements." She picked up Mary Blackwood's journal. "And we make sure this story is told accurately. Whatever happened to these children, all of them, they deserve to have the truth preserved." As they packed away the materials, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes. But for the first time since finding the photograph, she sensed no malice in that observation, only a profound relief. "I spent half the night researching Theodore Blackwood," he said, setting one coffee on her desk. "The more I dig, the worse it gets." Eleanor accepted the coffee gratefully. "Tell me." Martin opened the envelope and spread several printouts across her desk. Blackwood wasn't just responsible for the mill fire. His factories were notorious for their conditions, but he used his connections to silence critics and avoid regulation. He pointed to a newspaper clipping. 3 years before the fire, there was a smallpox outbreak at his South Boston factory. Instead of closing operations, he kept the children working until several collapsed on the factory floor. When authorities finally intervened, they found 2 children had died at their stations, but the machines were still running. Eleanor felt her stomach turn. And he was never held accountable? "Money and influence," Martin said grimly. "The same story throughout history." Laddie, what about after his children died? The ones in the portrait? Martin's expression darkened. That's where things get stranger. According to later records, Theodore and his wife lived into their 80s, unusually long lives for that era. Their business prospered, and they became even wealthier, but there are odd gaps in the public record about them after 1864. As if someone wanted to minimize their visibility, Eleanor mused. Exactly, and then there's this. Martin handed her a brittle newspaper clipping carefully preserved in a mylar sleeve. From 1870, 7 years after the portrait. The article described a bizarre incident at the Blackwood mansion during a holiday reception. Multiple guests reported seeing 4 children standing in the upstairs windows, watching the arriving carriages. When a concerned visitor mentioned this to Mrs. Blackwood, she reportedly became hysterical, insisting their children had gone away years earlier. The party was abruptly ended when Theodore Blackwood began screaming at empty corners of the ballroom, claiming someone was watching from the shadows. They were haunted, Eleanor whispered. It seems so, Martin agreed. And now I'm concerned we might have disturbed whatever uneasy peace was established. Eleanor sighed, rubbing her temples. We need to finish processing the collection, Martin. It's our job, but we'll take precautions. They spent the morning establishing protocols for handling the Blackwood materials. The portrait would remain sealed in its protective sleeve, stored separately from the other items. No additional photographs or scans would be made. Mary's journal would be transcribed by hand rather than digitized. Around noon, Dr. Lawrence Hoffman, the department chair, stopped by Eleanor's office. His usual cheerful demeanor seemed subdued. I understand you've begun work on the Blackwood collection, he said, closing the door behind him. Eleanor nodded. It's proving more complex than anticipated. Hoffman shifted uncomfortably. There's something you should know about that donation. The university initially declined it 20 years ago. What? Why? The previous curator claimed the materials were problematic, specifically a family portrait that allegedly caused equipment malfunctions and disturbed the archival staff. Hoffman looked embarrassed. The whole thing was deemed superstitious nonsense, of course. When the Blackwood descendant offered the collection again this year, with a substantial monetary donation attached, the administration reconsidered. Eleanor exchanged glances with Martin. Did the previous curator document these incidents? If he did, those records weren't preserved. The administration considered it an embarrassment. Hoffman straightened his tie nervously. I'm only telling you this because there's been a request from the president's office to feature the Blackwood portrait in the university's bicentennial exhibition next month. That's not possible, Eleanor said immediately. The photograph is too fragile for display. Hoffman frowned. The donation agreement specifically mentioned public exhibition of the materials. The portrait was explicitly highlighted. By whom? Martin asked. Which Blackwood descendant made the donation? A great-great-grandnephew, I believe. Edward Blackwood. Hoffman checked his watch. In fact, he's scheduled to tour the archives tomorrow. He's quite interested in how we're preserving his family's legacy. After Hoffman left, Eleanor turned to Martin. We need to find out everything we can about Edward Blackwood before he arrives tomorrow. Martin was already typing on his laptop. After several minutes, his expression grew troubled. Edward Blackwood isn't a blood relative at all. He was adopted by the last Blackwood heir in 2010, just months before the man died. He inherited the entire estate, including the family records and artifacts. That seems convenient, Eleanor muttered. There's almost no information about him before the adoption, Martin continued. It's as if he appeared out of nowhere at age 30 with no prior history. Eleanor stared out her window at the autumn leaves swirling across the university quad. Why would someone go to such lengths to place that portrait in a public institution? After keeping it private for over 150 years? Whatever's connected to that photograph, Martin said quietly. I don't think it's finished yet. Martin met her at the archive entrance, dark circles under his eyes suggesting his night had been no better. "I've secured the portrait in the conservation vault," he whispered. "We can show him the rest of the collection without involving that specific item." Eleanor nodded gratefully. "Good thinking." At precisely 10 o'clock, Dr. Hoffman arrived with their visitor. Edward Blackwood was tall and slender, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His age was difficult to determine, somewhere between 40 and 60, with no grey in his dark hair, but with deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. Those eyes, an unusual pale grey, seemed to evaluate everything with cold precision. "Dr. Walsh, Mr. Chen," he greeted them, his voice surprisingly soft. "I'm delighted to see my family's historical materials in such capable hands." Eleanor forced a professional smile. "We're honored to have been entrusted with the collection, Mr. Blackwood. We've begun the preservation process and preliminary cataloguing." "Excellent." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm particularly interested in the family portrait from 1863. I believe it captures a pivotal moment in the Blackwood legacy." Eleanor felt Martin tense beside her. "Many of the items require specialized conservation treatment before they can be handled," she explained smoothly. "The portrait is currently undergoing deacidification and stabilization." Blackwood's expression remained pleasant, but something in his gaze hardened. "I was assured it would be available today. In fact, my donation agreement specified continuous access to all materials." Dr. Hoffman looked nervously between them. "Perhaps we could retrieve it from conservation, just briefly." "Unfortunately, the process can't be interrupted without risking permanent damage," Martin interjected. "Conservation ethics require us to prioritize the artifact's integrity over access. I'm sure Mr. Blackwood understands our commitment to preserving his family's legacy properly." It was a professional trump card that Hoffman couldn't override without undermining the university's scholarly reputation. Blackwood seemed to recognize the impasse, his mouth tightening momentarily before relaxing into another empty smile. "Of course, conservation must take priority. Perhaps you could show me the other materials while we wait for the portrait to become available." "Indeed." For the next hour, they guided Blackwood through selected items from the collection, carefully avoiding Mary's journal and anything related to the children's deaths. Throughout the tour, Eleanor noticed their visitor paying minimal attention to the artifacts themselves, his gaze repeatedly scanning the room as if searching for something specific. "You haven't asked many questions about your ancestors," Eleanor observed carefully. "Most donors are curious about what we've learned about their family history." Blackwood's smile remained fixed. "The Blackwoods have always been private about certain aspects of their legacy. Some things are better left undisturbed." "Like the fate of the 4 children in the portrait?" Martin asked bluntly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Blackwood's pale eyes locked onto Martin with frightening intensity. "You've been researching beyond the materials I provided," he said, his soft voice now dangerously quiet. "It's our job as archivists to contextualize historical artifacts," Eleanor intervened. "The children's death so soon after the portrait was taken represents a significant family tragedy that impacts how we understand the collection." Blackwood stared at her for an uncomfortable moment, then abruptly changed tactics. "You're right, of course. In fact, the children's story is precisely why the portrait is so important. It needs to be publicly displayed, as specified in my donation agreement." Dr. Hoffman nodded eagerly, apparently relieved by the break in tension. "Yes, the bicentennial exhibition will provide an excellent opportunity to—" "No," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "The portrait cannot be displayed." Hoffman looked scandalized. "Dr. Walsh, you're overstepping your authority. The university has obligations to our donors." "There's something wrong with that photograph," she insisted, abandoning professional caution. "Everyone who's been involved with it has experienced disturbing phenomena. The original curator refused the collection because of it, and we've uncovered evidence suggesting it was connected to the deaths of 4 children." Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but something like satisfaction. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked quietly. "When you enlarged their faces, you saw their fear." Eleanor felt her blood run cold. She hadn't mentioned the digital enhancement or what they'd discovered. "Who are you really?" Martin demanded. "You're not a Blackwood descendant." Blackwood ignored him, his attention fixed on Eleanor. "The portrait needs to be displayed where many eyes will see it. That was our agreement." "Agreement with whom?" Eleanor asked. Instead of answering, Blackwood reached into his suit pocket and withdrew a small, leather-bound book. "This belongs with the collection. It was separated long ago, but should be reunited now." He placed it on the table between them. The cover bore no title, but the binding matched the style of Mary's journal. Eleanor reluctantly picked it up and opened to the first page. It contained a single sentence in faded brown ink. "He offers justice for the children, but the price is witnessing." "What does this mean?" she asked, looking up. But Edward Blackwood was gone. Dr. Hoffman stood blinking in confusion by the door. "Where did he go?" Eleanor demanded. "Who?" Hoffman asked, genuinely puzzled. "Edward Blackwood. He was just here." Hoffman frowned. "You've been showing me the collection for the past hour, Dr. Walsh. No one else has been here." Eleanor looked at Martin, whose ashen face confirmed her fear. They had both seen and spoken with Edward Blackwood, but Hoffman had no recollection of the man's presence. "The portrait," Martin whispered. "We need to check the vault." They raced to the conservation area, leaving a bewildered Hoffman behind. The secure vault was still locked, its electronic keypad showing no recent entries besides Martin's earlier access. Inside, the sealed sleeve containing the Blackwood portrait lay undisturbed. "It's still here," Eleanor said, relief washing over her. Martin didn't look convinced. "Let's check." Carefully, he slid the photograph partially out of its protective sleeve. The image was unchanged, Theodore and Mrs. Blackwood seated stoically, the 4 children standing behind them with their unnatural smiles. But as they stared at it, Eleanor noticed something she'd missed before. A barely perceptible figure reflected in the parlor mirror visible in the background, standing just behind the photographer. A tall, slender man in dark clothing. They worked methodically, gathering all Blackwood materials and locking them in separate archival storage boxes. Eleanor called campus security, requesting increased patrols near the archives overnight, citing concerns about valuable historical artifacts. By late afternoon, they had created a detailed inventory of every item connected to the Blackwood collection, cross-referenced with their initial processing notes to ensure nothing was missing. Only then did they turn their attention to the small leather book Edward Blackwood, or whatever he truly was, had left behind. The volume contained only a dozen pages with writing, all in the same faded brown ink. The entries were dated 1863, 1864, but no author was identified. Eleanor and Martin read them together in the silence of her office, the autumn sun setting outside her window. November 8th, 1863. The children speak of him constantly now. They call him the Thin Man, or sometimes the Watcher. I have begun to sense a presence myself when I am near them, a heaviness in the air, a feeling of being observed. Theodore dismisses their fears and forbids any mention of the portrait or the photographer. November 20th, 1863. Jonathan is dead. The official story is that he fell down the stairs, but the children know better. Little Elizabeth, who has not spoken in weeks, finally broke her silence tonight. She whispered to me that Uncle Jonathan saw the Thin Man and tried to destroy the portrait. "He promises justice," she said, "but first we must pay the price." When I asked what price, she would say no more. December 15, 1863. William was found in the Charles River this morning. Theodore claims it was an accident. The boy was always adventurous, he says. But I saw William's face when they pulled him from the water. His eyes were open wide, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The same expression I've begun to see on all the children's faces when they think no one is watching. January 3rd, 1864. Mary and Thomas have fallen ill with what the doctor calls influenza. Their fevers rage, yet they shiver constantly, claiming they feel cold hands touching them. I sit with them through the night, and sometimes, in the darkest hours, I glimpse a tall shadow moving against the wall, though there is nothing in the room to cast it. January 12th, 1864. Mary passed last night. Thomas follows close behind. Elizabeth refuses to enter their room, screaming that the thin man is collecting them one by one. Theodore has confined her to her bedroom, claiming hysteria. I fear for the child. I fear for us all. February 2nd, 1864. Elizabeth is gone, the last of the children. Theodore shows no grief, only irritation at the inconvenience. Something is very wrong with my husband. He sits for hours in the parlor, staring at the portrait as if waiting for something. Sometimes I hear him whispering, though there is no one else in the room. February 15th, 1864. I have discovered the truth. Before his death, Jonathan uncovered Theodore's involvement in the mill fire. The doors were locked by his direct order to prevent workers from leaving early. 17 children died. Their families sought justice, but Theodore's money silenced them. 3 of these orphaned children came into our home, Mary, Thomas, and Elizabeth, adopted by Theodore not from charity, but to assuage his guilt or perhaps to improve his public image after the scandal. I believe something followed these children, something connected to the 17 souls lost in the fire. It used the portrait somehow, the photographer capturing more than just our family's image that day. William tried to warn us. He knew from the beginning, perhaps because he was not connected to the mill tragedy. The presence grows stronger now that the children are gone. I feel it watching constantly. Theodore has made some kind of bargain with it, though he will not speak of it to me. He has changed, become cruel in ways I never witnessed before. Sometimes I see something else looking out through his eyes. The final entry was dated March 1st, 1864, the handwriting increasingly frantic and difficult to decipher. He is coming for me next. I understand now that Theodore sacrificed the children to save himself. The entity required payment, life for life. 17 children died because of his greed, so it took our 4 children in partial payment. But the debt is not settled. It will never be settled until justice is complete. I have hidden Mary's journal where he cannot find it. The truth must survive. If you are reading this, beware the portrait. It is a door, and it is still open. The journal ended there. Eleanor sat back, feeling physically ill. "Mrs. Blackwood," she whispered. "These are her words. She disappeared from public records after 1864, but there was never a death certificate." "Another convenient accident, no doubt," Martin said grimly. Eleanor turned to the book's final page, which contained a list of 17 names, children aged 7 to 12, the victims of the mill fire. Beside each name was a small, carefully drawn symbol that resembled an eye. "He said the portrait needs to be displayed, where many eyes will see it," Eleanor recalled. "That was our agreement. What if he wasn't talking about his donor agreement with the university?" Martin's expression darkened with understanding. "The entity in the portrait, the watcher, it feeds on being seen." "Not just seen," Eleanor corrected, thinking of the transformed faces in the digital enlargement. "It feeds on the fear it creates in those who truly see it. The children in the portrait, their expressions change when magnified because the truth is revealed under closer inspection. And in the digital age," Martin added, "an exhibition would mean thousands of people potentially enlarging the image on their phones or computers, experiencing what we did." Eleanor shuddered at the thought. "Exposing that many people to whatever lives in that photograph? We can't let that happen," Martin said firmly. "We need to find a way to contain this permanently." Like this, as they continued discussing options, Eleanor's office phone rang. It was the security office. "Dr. Walsh, this is Officer Williams. There's someone here asking for access to the archives. A Dr. Edward Blackwood." He claims he has an appointment regarding a family donation. Eleanor froze, meeting Martin's alarmed gaze. Officer Williams, that man is not authorized to enter the archives under any circumstances. Please escort him from the building. Understood. Should I call campus police? Yes, Eleanor said without hesitation. And please come to my office afterward. There's something you need to know. After hanging up, they waited anxiously for Officer Williams to return. 20 minutes passed with no word. Finally, Eleanor's phone rang again. Dr. Walsh. Williams here. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. There was no visitor at the security desk. But you just called about Edward Blackwood. Eleanor insisted. No, ma'am. This is my first call to your office today. After hanging up, Eleanor looked at Martin with growing dread. It's toying with us. We need to destroy that photograph, Martin said. Tonight. Eleanor had spent the evening researching methods to destroy photographs without creating toxic fumes. A simple fire would release dangerous chemicals from the 19th century photographic processes. Instead, they brought a solution of sodium hydroxide that would dissolve the emulsion without harmful vapors. This feels wrong, Martin whispered as they entered the archive. Destroying historical artifacts goes against everything we stand for professionally. Sometimes preservation means knowing what not to preserve, Eleanor replied, thinking of the terror in those children's faces. Whatever Theodore Blackwood invited into his family's life, it's still active, still dangerous. They retrieved the portrait from the vault and brought it to the conservation workstation. Eleanor laid out a plastic tray and prepared the chemical solution, while Martin carefully removed the photograph from its protective sleeve. As the portrait was exposed to the air, the overhead lights flickered briefly. A cold draft moved through the room despite the closed windows and doors. "Ari," Martin urged. Eleanor took a deep breath and picked up the photograph. As she held it over the chemical bath, the image seemed to shift slightly in her hands, though the movement was too subtle to be certain. "For the children," she whispered, and lowered the portrait into the solution. The effect was immediate and shocking. The chemicals began to dissolve the emulsion as expected, but as the image degraded, a high-pitched sound filled the room, not quite a scream, but a noise that made their teeth ache and their eyes water. The lights overhead pulsed rapidly, casting strobing shadows across the walls. "Keep going," Martin encouraged, though his face had gone pale. The portrait was half dissolved now, the faces of the family distorting and melting away. The noise intensified, becoming a tangible pressure against their eardrums. Eleanor forced herself to continue, even as books began to fall from shelves and the temperature in the room plummeted until their breath fogged in the air. As the last recognizable features of the portrait disappeared into the chemical bath, a final surge of energy pulsed through the room. The lights exploded overhead, showering them with glass as darkness engulfed the archive. In that moment of blackness, Eleanor felt something brush past her, a cold presence that smelled of dust and decay. Then silence. Emergency lights activated, casting the room in that same eerie red glow they'd experienced during the storm. Eleanor and Martin stood motionless, staring at the tray where only a dark, formless sludge remained of the Blackwood portrait. "Is it over?" Martin whispered. Before Eleanor could answer, her phone chimed with a notification. With trembling fingers, she checked the screen, expecting to see another impossible image or message. Instead, it was an email from the university's digital archive system, automatically generated at 12:17 a.m. File restoration complete. Blackwood family portrait 1863 TIFF has been recovered from backup and restored to the main server. "No," she breathed. "The digital copy, it's still in the system." Martin grabbed his laptop and accessed the university's digital archive. There it was. The high-resolution scan Eleanor had created on that first day before they understood what they were dealing with. The file had been deleted during their earlier containment efforts, but the automated backup system had restored it during overnight maintenance. Delete it again, Eleanor urged. Martin tried, but an error message appeared. Access denied. This file has been classified as priority preservation by administrative override. Someone's locked us out, he realized. But who has that level of access besides us? The answer came moments later, as Martin's email chimed with a new message from Dr. Hoffman. Martin and Eleanor, I'm pleased to inform you that the Blackwood family portrait has been selected as the centerpiece for our bicentennial exhibition. The President was particularly impressed by its historical significance after meeting with our benefactor this afternoon. The digital file has been secured and will be used to create a large format print for the main exhibition hall. The unveiling is scheduled for next week, with approximately 2,000 guests expected to attend the opening reception. Please prepare appropriate descriptive text for the display. Mr. Edward Blackwood has specifically requested that we encourage visitors to examine the details of the children's faces closely, perhaps through digital kiosks where the image can be magnified. This is a tremendous opportunity for our department and the university. Lawrence Hoffman, Eleanor and Martin stared at each other in horror as the implications became clear. The entity hadn't been destroyed, it had evolved, adapting to the digital age. The portrait was no longer just a physical object, but a digital file that could be endlessly copied, shared, and viewed by thousands. We have 7 days to stop this, Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. Or whatever the Blackwoods unleashed in 1863 will finally get what it's been waiting for all these years. So, what exactly are we dealing with? Eleanor asked, rubbing her exhausted eyes. A ghost, a demon, some kind of psychic imprint. Martin shook his head. Labels don't matter. What matters is what it wants and how it operates. He pointed to their timeline of events. It manifested through the portrait in 1863, shortly after the mill fire that killed 17 children. It targeted the Blackwood children first, particularly the 3 who were adopted from families affected by the fire. A connection to the victims, Eleanor nodded. But why didn't it just take Theodore Blackwood? He was the one responsible for their deaths. Mrs. Blackwood's journal suggests he made some kind of bargain, Martin reminded her, sacrificing the children, and eventually her, to save himself. Eleanor considered this. And now, over 160 years later, this Edward Blackwood appears with the portrait, insisting it be displayed publicly. He said that was their agreement. What if Theodore's bargain wasn't just for himself, Martin suggested. What if it extended to his descendants, protection in exchange for feeding the entity periodically? And now they've found a way to feed it on a massive scale, Eleanor concluded grimly. Not just 4 children, but potentially thousands of viewers, all experiencing that moment of terror when they see the truth in the magnified image. They spent the morning trying to reach Dr. Hoffman, but he wasn't answering calls or emails. A visit to his office found it locked, with his assistant claiming he'd taken unexpected personal leave. The university president's office was similarly unresponsive, referring all questions about the exhibition to the events committee. By afternoon, they had shifted tactics. If they couldn't stop the exhibition through official channels, they needed a technological solution. Martin contacted a former student who now worked in cybersecurity. We need to corrupt that file, he explained when Aisha Khan arrived at Eleanor's apartment. Make it unreadable or replace it with something harmless. Aisha looked skeptical. You want me to hack the university's secure server? That's not just against policy, it's potentially criminal. People could die, Aisha, Eleanor said quietly. I know how that sounds, but we're not exaggerating. Something in Eleanor's expression must have conveyed her desperation, because Aisha's skepticism gave way to reluctant cooperation. I'll need to know exactly which file and what you want done to it. They explained the situation, omitting the supernatural elements and framing it as a concern about a historical artifact that could trigger seizures or severe psychological responses if viewed improperly. Aisha didn't seem entirely convinced by this explanation, but agreed to help anyway. The university uses a remarkably outdated system, she explained as she worked. That's both good and bad for us, easier to exploit but also unpredictable. After several hours of work, Aisha looked up from her laptop with a troubled expression. I can access the system, but the file isn't there. What do you mean? Martin asked. We saw it in the repository last night. The path exists, but the file itself has been moved or copied elsewhere. There's just a placeholder linking to an external server. She showed them her screen, where a string of unfamiliar code pointed to an off-site location. Can you trace it? Eleanor asked. Aisha tried, but the external server was well protected. This isn't university-level security, she explained. This is serious corporate or government-grade protection. They can't break through without specialized equipment and a lot more time. After Aisha left, promising to keep trying through back channels, Eleanor and Martin faced the grim reality that their technical solution had failed. The exhibition was now just 5 days away. We need to find Edward Blackwood, Eleanor decided. He's the key to all of this. Martin nodded in agreement. But how? He doesn't seem to exist in any normal sense. Eleanor thought back to their encounters with the man. He said the portrait needed to be seen by many eyes. That was their agreement. But agreements have terms, conditions on both sides. You think we can negotiate with this thing? I think we need to understand the original bargain Theodore Blackwood made, Eleanor replied. And for that, we need to go to where it all started. The next morning, they drove to the site of Theodore Blackwood's primary textile mill in South Boston. The original building had been demolished decades ago, replaced by a nondescript office complex. In the small park across the street, however, stood a modest memorial plaque installed by a historical society in the 1970s, commemorating the victims of the 1863 fire. Eleanor approached the plaque, reading the 17 names engraved there, the same names listed in Mrs. Blackwood's journal. As she traced her fingers over the letters, a cold wind swept through the otherwise still autumn air. Dr. Walsh. She turned to find Edward Blackwood standing behind her, his tall figure casting an impossibly long shadow across the memorial garden despite the overcast day. You destroyed the original portrait, he said, his voice devoid of anger or any other emotion. That was unexpected. What are you? Martin demanded, moving protectively toward Eleanor. Blackwood's empty smile returned. A facilitator, a keeper of bargains. Theodore Blackwood made a deal in 1863 to save himself from justice. The price was steep, 4 innocent lives initially, and a promise that future generations would continue to feed what waits behind the portrait. Feed it what? Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Fear, recognition, witness. Blackwood's pale eyes seemed to grow darker as he spoke. For over a century, the Blackwood family has maintained their end of the bargain, providing small exhibitions, private viewings, controlled exposure. But such methods are inefficient in the modern age. So you've adapted, Martin said, gone digital. Blackwood inclined his head slightly. Evolution is necessary for survival. The hunger has grown over the generations. The debt remains unpaid. The debt for the 17 children who died in the fire, Eleanor said. Theodore Blackwood locked those doors, Blackwood confirmed. He heard them screaming as the flames rose. He did nothing. Justice was denied them in life. And the entity in the portrait, it offers them justice? Eleanor asked. It offers balance. An eye for an eye, a witness for a witness. Blackwood gestured to the plaque. They died unseen, unacknowledged. The debt is paid through witnessing. Witnessing what? Martin demanded. Blackwood's smile widened slightly. The truth. When people look into the magnified faces of those children in the portrait, they see their terror. They share it, briefly. They witness what Theodore Blackwood refused to see. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. And what happens after the exhibition? After thousands of people have witnessed through the digital image? The hunger will be satisfied, the debt paid, the door will close. I don't believe you, Eleanor said. This isn't about justice for those children. This is about feeding something that's using their tragedy as a lure. For the first time, Blackwood's composure slipped. A flash of genuine anger crossed his features, transforming his face momentarily into something inhuman. "You understand nothing," he hissed, his voice suddenly multi-layered, as if several people were speaking at once. "The portrait must be seen. The agreement must be honored." "Or what?" Martin challenged. Blackwood straightened, his features smoothing back into their usual impassivity. "History repeats, Dr. Walsh, Mr. Chen. Doors that are not properly closed allow passage in both directions. What has been contained for generations will find new vessels, new witnesses." He turned to leave, then paused. "The exhibition will proceed. You cannot stop what has already begun. The file exists in thousands of copies now, on servers across the world. The university's promotional materials have already included thumbnail images sent to tens of thousands of potential attendees." With that, he walked away, his figure seeming to blur at the edges until he disappeared around a corner. "He's right about one thing," Martin said quietly. "We can't destroy every copy of that file now that it's been distributed." Eleanor stared at the memorial plaque, thinking of 17 children trapped behind locked doors as flames consumed them. She thought of Mary Blackwood's journal entries and the terror in the faces of the children in the portrait when magnified. "Maybe we're approaching this all wrong," she said slowly. "We've been trying to contain this thing, to stop people from seeing the portrait. But what if that's not what the children want?" "What do you mean?" Eleanor turned to face Martin, a new determination in her eyes. "What if they really do want justice? What if they want their story told? The truth about what Theodore Blackwood did, the truth that was covered up for over a century and a half." Understanding dawned on Martin's face. Not containment, but exposure. Not of the portrait itself, but of the history behind it. Eleanor nodded. "Exactly. We can't stop the exhibition, but we can change the narrative. We can make sure that everyone who sees that portrait knows exactly what they're looking at. Not just a family photograph, but evidence of a historical crime and its aftermath. A different kind of witnessing," Martin said, "one that might actually deliver the justice those children were denied." They hurried back to campus, a plan forming between them. They had just 4 days until the exhibition opening to uncover the full truth of the Blackwood legacy and ensure it could no longer remain hidden. "Are we ready?" Martin asked, joining her with a tablet in hand. Eleanor nodded grimly, "As ready as we'll ever be." The past 4 days had been a whirlwind of research, writing, and careful planning. Unable to prevent the exhibition, they had instead worked to transform it into something the entity behind the portrait hadn't anticipated. With help from colleagues in various departments, many of whom were skeptical but willing to trust Eleanor's academic reputation, they had constructed a comprehensive historical investigation into Theodore Blackwood and the 1863 mill fire. University administration had initially resisted their revised exhibition text, but Eleanor had leveraged her professional standing and the support of several influential faculty members to force a compromise. The portrait would be displayed as planned, but surrounded by their meticulously researched historical context. "Our digital countermeasures are in place," Martin confirmed, checking his tablet. Aisha came through. While they couldn't prevent the digital file from being displayed, Aisha had managed to implement a subtle modification to the exhibition's display system. When viewers used the digital kiosks to examine the details of the portrait, they would indeed see magnified portions of the image, but with a crucial difference. Rather than revealing the terrified expressions that Eleanor and Martin had witnessed, the magnification would trigger overlays of historical documentation. Newspaper accounts of the mill fire, worker testimonies about the locked doors, evidence of Theodore Blackwood's culpability, and the suspicious deaths of the 4 children and Jonathan Blackwood in the months following the portrait. "No sign of our friend?" Eleanor asked, scanning the growing crowd of attendees. "Not yet," Martin replied, "but he'll be here. This is what he's been working toward." The exhibition was scheduled to begin at 8:00 p.m., with remarks from the university president, followed by the unveiling of the Blackwood portrait. By 7:45, the gallery was filled with donors, faculty, students, and community members. Eleanor spotted Dr. Hoffman near the president, looking uncharacteristically tense. At precisely 8:00, the president approached the podium. "Distinguished guests, faculty, students, and friends of the university, welcome to this historic celebration of our institution's bicentennial." As the speech continued, Eleanor noticed a disturbance at the gallery entrance. Edward Blackwood had arrived, his tall figure unmistakable even from across the room. He surveyed the exhibition with his cold, pale eyes, eventually finding Eleanor in the crowd. The empty smile appeared on his face as he nodded slightly in her direction. The president concluded his remarks and moved toward the veiled portrait. "It is my great honor to unveil the centerpiece of our historical exhibition, a remarkable family portrait from 1863 that offers a window into Boston's industrial past and the legacy of one of our city's most influential families." With a dramatic gesture, he pulled the cord, and the velvet drapes parted to reveal the massive digital display of the Blackwood portrait. A murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd as they took in the remarkable clarity of the enlarged historical image. "We invite you to explore this fascinating artifact through our interactive kiosks," the president continued, "where you can examine details of the portrait and learn about the Blackwood family's place in Boston history." Attendees began to disperse throughout the gallery, many moving toward the digital kiosks positioned around the room. Eleanor watched anxiously as the first viewers began to interact with the displays, magnifying portions of the portrait. Instead of experiencing the horror that she and Martin had seen, they were presented with historical documents and photographs. The truth about Theodore Blackwood and the tragic events of 1863. Across the room, Edward Blackwood's expression changed as he observed what was happening. The empty smile vanished, replaced by a look of growing concern. He moved swiftly toward the nearest kiosk, pushing aside a startled viewer to access the controls himself. Eleanor and Martin exchanged glances and moved to intercept him, but before they could reach him, the lights in the gallery flickered momentarily. When they stabilized, Blackwood was standing directly before them, his tall figure somehow having crossed the room impossibly fast. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice carrying that same multi-layered quality they had heard in the park. "We're telling the truth," Eleanor replied steadily. "All of it. Isn't that what you wanted? For people to witness?" "This is not the witnessing that was agreed upon," Blackwood hissed. "No," Martin said, "it's better. It's real justice for those children, not just fear that feeds whatever you really are." Around them, attendees were moving from kiosk to kiosk, expressions of shock and interest on their faces as they absorbed the dark history behind the seemingly innocent family portrait. On the massive display, the Blackwood family stared out impassively, but Eleanor noticed something changing in the children's faces. Their unnatural smiles were fading, replaced by expressions that were solemn, but no longer terrified. Blackwood must have noticed it too, because he turned toward the display with a look of alarm. "No, this is not how it ends." "I think it is," Eleanor said. "You offered those children justice in exchange for feeding on people's fear. But real justice isn't about fear. It's about truth, about acknowledgement, about making sure Theodore Blackwood can't hide his crimes anymore, even a century and a half later." The lights flickered again, more violently this time. Several attendees looked up in confusion. The temperature in the gallery dropped suddenly, causing people to shiver and draw their coats tighter. "You cannot break the agreement," Blackwood insisted, his form seeming less solid somehow, the edges of his figure blurring into the shadows cast by the exhibition lighting. "We're not breaking it," Martin countered. "We're fulfilling it properly. The children are being witnessed. Their story is being told. The truth about Theodore Blackwood is finally exposed." On the massive display, something impossible was happening. The digital image was changing, though the file itself remained unaltered. The four children's expressions had completely transformed, no longer smiling, no longer terrified, but looking directly at the gallery with clear, steady gazes. Behind them, barely visible in the shadowy background, the indistinct figure that had once menaced them was fading, dissolving into the portrait's dark corners. Blackwood made a sudden movement toward Eleanor, his hand outstretched as if to grab her, but his fingers passed through her arm like smoke. He stared at his increasingly transparent hand with what might have been fear, the first genuine emotion Eleanor had seen on his face. "The children's debt is paid," Eleanor said quietly. "They've been witnessed properly now. Whatever bargain Theodore Blackwood made with you, it doesn't include them anymore." "This changes nothing," Blackwood insisted, though his voice was weaker, the multiple layers separating into distinct, childlike whispers. "The Blackwood line continues. The door remains open." "Not anymore," Martin said, pointing to the massive display. The portrait had changed again. Theodore and Mrs. Blackwood remained as they had been, but where the four children had stood, there were now 17 different children, the victims of the mill fire, standing solemn and dignified, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten. Blackwood's form was barely visible now, a thin outline of a man that seemed to be unraveling at the edges. "This is not the end," he whispered, his voice now a chorus of children's voices speaking in unison. "There will be other doors, other bargains." "Perhaps," Eleanor acknowledged, "but not here. Not with these children. Not anymore." With a sound like a distant sigh, Edward Blackwood, or whatever had worn that shape, dissolved completely, leaving nothing behind but a momentary chill in the air. Around them, the exhibition continued, attendees moving from display to display, absorbing the tragic history of the Blackwood family and the 17 children who had died in that long-ago fire. On the massive screen, the portrait had returned to its original appearance. Theodore and Mrs. Blackwood seated stoically, the four children standing behind them. But their expressions were different now, peaceful, their gazes direct and clear. In the weeks that followed, the Blackwood exhibition became the most successful in the university's history, drawing record crowds and extensive media coverage. The story of Theodore Blackwood's responsibility for the mill fire and the subsequent deaths in his family became the subject of academic papers, a documentary film, and eventually a book co-authored by Eleanor Walsh and Martin Chen. The digital file of the portrait never displayed the terrifying transformations that Eleanor and Martin had witnessed that first day. Whatever had lived within that image, whatever had fed on fear and made bargains with the guilty, had found no purchase in an exhibition dedicated to truth and remembrance rather than horror. On the one-year anniversary of the exhibition, Eleanor visited the small memorial in South Boston that commemorated the mill fire victims. She placed 17 white roses beside the plaque bearing their names. "Rest now," she whispered to the autumn air. "You've been witnessed." As she turned to leave, she glimpsed a group of children in the distance, solemn-faced but peaceful, watching her for a moment before fading into the October sunlight. Some doors, once properly closed, remain that way.